The boarding gate was crowded, the plane nearly ready for departure, when suddenly 2 security officers stepped into the aisle and stopped a woman dressed in a quiet, elegant suit. To everyone else, she looked like just another passenger waiting to take her seat. But within seconds, whispers spread, eyes turned, and phones began to rise as security ordered her off the plane. She tried to stay calm, explaining that she had done nothing wrong. Yet the stares, the suspicion, and the humiliation followed her down the aisle like a shadow she couldn't escape. What they saw was a black woman they believed didn't belong there. What they didn't see was the power she held behind the scenes, power that could shake the entire airline industry. And before this flight ever left the ground, one decision made in that aisle would cost the airline billions. The question is, how did a moment of humiliation turn into a $5 billion mistake they would never forget? For most people at the airport that afternoon, it was just another busy travel day, rolling suitcases, final boarding calls, and passengers rushing to catch their flights. But for Monica Hayes, the trip meant something more important. Monica wasn't just traveling for business. She was one of the most respected financial leaders in the tech investment world, the CEO of a powerful venture capital firm that quietly backed some of the fastest-growing companies in America. Her days were usually filled with boardrooms, billion-dollar negotiations, and decisions that shaped entire industries. Yet despite the power she held in those rooms, Monica had learned long ago that the world outside them didn't always see her the same way. That afternoon, she walked through the airport dressed simply, an elegant blazer, a carry-on bag, and a calm confidence that came from years of hard work. No entourage, no attention, just another passenger heading to her seat. The flight she boarded wasn't just routine either. On the surface, it was a standard business trip across the country. But behind the scenes, the airline she was flying with was in the middle of something massive, a financial partnership that could bring billions of dollars into its future. And Monica Hayes was directly connected to it. None of the passengers around her knew that. Neither did the flight attendants. And the security officers walking down the aisle toward her definitely didn't. Because within minutes, something would happen on that plane that would turn an ordinary flight into a moment the airline would regret for years to come. Monica had just settled into her seat when the tension in the cabin shifted. At first, it was subtle. A flight attendant standing a little too long in the aisle. A quiet whisper between 2 crew members near the galley. The kind of small, uneasy movements most passengers would ignore. But Monica noticed. Years of high-stakes negotiations had sharpened her instincts. Something was off. A few minutes later, 2 airport security officers stepped onto the plane. Their presence alone caused heads to turn. Passengers glanced up from their phones as the officers scanned the rows slowly, deliberately, until their eyes landed on Monica. The walk down the aisle felt heavier with every step they took. When they stopped beside her seat, the entire row went silent. One of the officers asked for her boarding pass and identification. His voice wasn't loud, but the tone carried a quiet suspicion that immediately drew attention from nearby passengers. Monica calmly handed over her documents, assuming it was some kind of routine check. But the officers didn't leave. They studied the boarding pass, looked back at her, then exchanged a glance that made Monica's stomach tighten. Moments later, one of them told her she needed to step off the plane. No explanation. No clear reason. Just a firm order. Confused, Monica asked what the problem was. Her ticket was valid. Her seat was assigned. She had boarded like everyone else. But the answers never came. Instead, the officer repeated the request, this time louder, drawing the attention of nearly half the cabin. Now people were staring. Phones slowly began to rise. Some passengers watched with curiosity, others with quiet discomfort. A few whispered to each other, trying to piece together what was happening. Monica felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her. She remained calm, explaining again that there must be a mistake. She showed them her identification, her boarding confirmation, everything they asked for. Still, the officers insisted. The situation was escalating quickly. One of them gestured toward the aisle, making it clear that this was no longer a request. The humiliation crept in slowly, the kind that burns quietly under the surface. Monica had spent decades building a reputation of excellence, discipline, and leadership. Yet in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. To them, she was just someone who didn't belong. The tension inside the cabin grew thicker with every passing second. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others watched with silent disbelief. Finally, realizing the confrontation was only drawing more attention, Monica slowly stood up. The aisle felt impossibly long as she walked toward the front of the plane, guided by the officers. Conversations had completely stopped now. The only sounds were the soft clicks of phones recording and the distant hum of the aircraft's engines. But what no one in that cabin realized was that the woman they had just watched being escorted off the plane held influence that stretched far beyond that narrow aisle. And the moment her feet touched the jet bridge, a chain reaction quietly began, one that would soon send shockwaves through the entire airline. The moment Monica stepped off the plane, the door closed behind her with a dull, final sound. Inside the cabin, passengers were still whispering, still watching through the small windows as security escorted her down the jet bridge like she had done something wrong. But outside that aircraft, the atmosphere felt even colder. The officers stopped near the gate desk, still holding her identification. Passengers waiting in the terminal had begun to notice. Some slowed their steps, others openly stared. A few phones lifted again, recording every second. Monica stood there, calm on the outside, but the humiliation was impossible to ignore. Years of discipline kept her voice steady as she asked the same question again. Why was she being removed? One officer finally gave an answer, but it only made the moment worse. There had been a report. Someone had questioned whether she belonged in the seat she was assigned. Someone thought her ticket might not be legitimate. In other words, someone had looked at her and decided she didn't belong in first class. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. For a moment, Monica said nothing. She simply looked around at the growing crowd, the phones recording, the quiet judgment in the room. Then something shifted. Slowly, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. The officer watched carefully, still suspicious, as she scrolled through a few contacts. Her expression had changed now, not angry, not emotional, focused. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a calm authority that made the gate agent pause. She asked for the name of the airline's corporate relations director. The officers exchanged confused looks. Within minutes, a call was placed. And that was when the tone of the entire situation began to change. Because the woman they had just removed from the plane wasn't just a passenger. She was the person responsible for approving a $5 billion investment deal the airline had been negotiating for months. And at that exact moment, standing in the middle of the terminal with cameras recording everything, Monica Hayes quietly made a decision. One that would soon send shockwaves straight to the airline's executive boardroom. By the time the flight finally departed, Monica Hayes was no longer anywhere near the gate. But inside the airline's headquarters, panic had already begun to spread. What started as a routine security check was now turning into something far bigger than anyone on that plane had imagined. Within hours, senior executives were being alerted. Phone calls rushed across departments. Legal teams were suddenly involved. Because the woman who had been publicly removed from their aircraft was not just a passenger. She was the financial authority behind a massive investment partnership the airline had been quietly negotiating for months, one worth nearly $5 billion. And now, that deal was gone. Monica didn't shout. She didn't demand revenge. She simply withdrew the funding and walked away. The consequences came quickly. News of the incident began circulating online, fueled by the passenger videos recorded in that cabin. Questions spread across social media. How could an airline chasing billion-dollar partnerships fail to recognize the very person holding the deal in her hands? But for Monica, the loss of a business agreement wasn't the real issue. The real issue was something deeper. Because in that moment on the plane, none of her achievements mattered. Not the companies she had built. Not the billions she managed. Not the respect she had earned in boardrooms across the country. All some people saw was a black woman they believed didn't belong. And that is the part of a story that echoes far beyond one airport, one airline, or one humiliating moment. It forces a question many people still struggle to answer. If someone with power, success, and influence can be treated this way in public, what happens to those who don't have billions behind their name? How many stories like this happen every day without cameras watching? And more importantly, when will the world finally learn to see people for who they truly are?